Today we have an excellent panel for you, and we're going to talk about technology, because I think one way or another this COVID or coronavirus crisis has definitely shown how much we depend on technology, how technology can be useful, and definitely many people are already rethinking that once they go back to their work, technology is going to be different and life is going to be different. We have an excellent panel for you. We have Will Reinhardt, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity. Hi there, Will.
How's it going? How are you doing today?
Doing well. We also have Eli Dorado, who is also a Senior Research Fellow at Center for Growth and Opportunity. How are you doing, Eli?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. And we have Stephen Hicks, who is a Senior Scholar at the Atlas Society. We'll go back to Stephen a little bit later. Let's start with Will. Well, so you guys, you study broadband, you study internet privacy. Can you share us some thoughts in about 3 to 5 minutes? How do you think this whole thing is going to turn out?
Yeah, so I think that there's really obviously two things that I'm particularly interested with this current crisis. There's really two issues in tech that I see that are really truly important, which is obviously one of them is broadband and kind of the pipes, and the other is privacy concerns, especially with tracking technologies or tracing technologies. So just really quickly, unlike other networks, the internet really has been pretty resilient throughout this pandemic, and it's really one of the bright spots, if there really truly are any bright spots in this kind of horrible time. A lot of other supply chains have been buckling. We have heard a lot about paper products and fruits and vegetables having problems at getting stocked in grocery stores. And obviously a part of this is because at least half of all the fruits and vegetables in the U.S. were sold through the food sector and had to shift down and shift completely to traditional consumer and through grocery stores. This really has been part of a massive change that people are starting to consume effectively everything at home, and schools and workplaces have been forced to shutter. And what this means then effectively at the same time is that internet demand has dramatically increased. But what's really interesting is that, with all of these problems, we really haven't seen too many issues that have occurred with internet networks. So it's really hard to describe some of the dramatic changes, but I think some statistics really can put a fine point on this. So data usage over really a 2-month period increased by almost a third, almost by 33%, which is pretty dramatic. Moreover, we saw peak hours in the internet shift from late evening towards the afternoon. So most of this has been due to video conferencing and audio conferencing, like what we're doing right now. In a normal world or in a normal life, we would be together on a panel and a stage talking about some of these topics. And you really have seen this dramatic change, especially for one company, really. Zoom, it's helpful to remember, Zoom, everyone seems to be using Zoom now, but in December, Zoom had something only like 10 million users. As of April, it has 300 million users, and this is in a massive change between these two time periods. It really puts this company in the realm of Twitter. So it's been fascinating to watch. There's really, I think, been two kind of interesting things that we can talk about, during our conversation. But at least with the internet, there's been obviously kind of two sets of groups that have been adapting. There have been some that have been able to kind of quickly change. Our group has gone online mostly, and a lot of tech companies have gone online. Twitter has gone online and Facebook. And when I say this online, I really mean they're going towards remote work, and they're shifting towards these kind of remote schedules and remote technologies that have been still, even for them, very difficult to adapt to. But then some of the older institutions that we also think about pretty extensively are struggling, really. Schools are struggling pretty dramatically. A lot of traditional offices are struggling. In Fairfax County, for example, I live fairly close to Fairfax County. I think actually Eli lives in Fairfax. Oh, no, you live, yeah, sorry, you live on the other end. Anyway, so in Fairfax, they actually got rid of their chief technology officer because of problems related to remote work. LA County has had to budget something like $200 million in new costs because of this shift to remote education. So all of this has been pretty dramatic and a pretty big change for a lot of individuals and a lot of institutions. Some have struggled, some have done much better. But there also have been obviously some big regulatory changes that have come with this. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the CARES Act. The CARES Act has a whole bunch of money for remote education. Something like $16 billion was allocated. Another $200 million is going towards telehealth programs. And also the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, has been working closely with the Department of Education and the United States Department of Agriculture in order to get funds out to groups that actually could use them. So there's a lot that's been going on. I don't want to focus too much on that, especially if people have questions about it, but there's a couple things that I think that really should be considered when, or at least some things that are coming up that people really should be aware about. First off, what are the states going to do with these, with funding broadband potentially? I know a lot of the smaller states have talked about this. There's also this really big, interesting question about what's going to happen with the next CARES package. Will there be a lot more funding? And, something that Eli and I have been talking a lot about and thinking about is, how is remote work going to shift as well? That I think is a really big question. How do cities change in response to some of these dramatic changes and these kind of equilibrium shifts? So we're seeing all this occur with broadband, but the other major area that we see a lot of really big interest is really in Google and Apple's efforts to establish an exposure notification API, as it's called. So they're working together to create this framework, and it's kind of a clever little framework that allows cell phones to effectively, tell each other that they're in the vicinity of each other, while also ensuring that that each individual cell phone doesn't know the identity of the other individual. And the entire purpose of this is to effectively allow for the creation of a database that the phone itself downloads every single day, and it tracks against known COVID cases, such that if individuals kind of come into contact with somebody that they later learn actually has COVID, that they're able to get information to go and talk to their doctors or to their public health officials. I should mention, obviously, this is something that's going on right now. Google and Apple haven't created the apps themselves. They're merely creating this broader framework such that other companies, in particular, really, it's going to be public health officials at the local level, are able to then go in and create an app. Some states have already done this. So states like, Utah, for example, where our organization is based, has already put together an app. And there's really a whole slew of different kinds of questions that are related to this as well. I think that there's obviously a lot more to say about this topic. I really do hope that people really kind of dive into it really in depth, because honestly, there has been some confusion about what's really happening. I'm quite positive about this Apple Google project, but there's also something else that's going on, which is done currently through the CDC, which is that the CDC is looking to put together a greater surveillance apparatus. And we really don't have as good of details about what's going on there through the CDC, this other separate program of tracing individuals and figuring out their COVID status. So there's a lot that's going on right now. And hopefully at least that is helpful in breaking down some of the major issues that are currently being discussed.
Oh, absolutely. The moment you mentioned cell phones tracking each other, I mean, I've seen enough superhero and supervillain movies to know that usually doesn't turn out right. So yeah, I have a gazillion questions myself. We have 483 people registered for this webinar. So guys, if you are basically flabbergasted and saying, what is happening? Please put your questions in the Zoom Q&A feature and we'll definitely pass them on to Will. There will be questions, Will, but now let me introduce our second panelist, who's also a senior research fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity, and that's Eli Dorado. Just like Will, his work and writing has appeared in New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and basically all the other stuff we all read. So Eli, what is your take on the role of technology in, let's say, post-COVID world?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I am thinking a lot in terms of the recovery, after this is over. I think it's difficult to really grow the economy while everyone is, in this sort of extreme social distancing mode. But at some point, hopefully, this will end, and then we have to do the hard work of rebuilding all of the economic linkages and patterns that have been destroyed through this necessary response. And so my research is focused, mainly on transportation and infrastructure, because I think that is one of the great levers for driving growth as we emerge from the pandemic. Directly, transportation accounts for about 9% of GDP. But even more than that, 9%, it's important to remember that virtually all economic activity is spatial, notwithstanding a slight shift towards remote work that may stick with us a little bit after the pandemic. Almost all economic activity involves physical products, being shipped to customers, and goods and services that have to even be delivered in person in a sort of high bandwidth in person-to-person exchange. So we see over and over again in history that transportation breakthroughs are what drives growth. The first wave of globalization that happened in the second half of the 19th century was due to the steamship. Would not have happened without the invention of the steamship. And of course, the invention of the jet aircraft in the 1950s is what makes the modern world possible. If we did not have that, we would go back quite some ways in terms of our prosperity. So that's one reason I look at transportation infrastructure. But the other reason is that it's an area in which we have stagnated technologically, especially in the U.S. So nowhere is that more visible than in the jet aircraft, which I just mentioned. Right today, we actually cruise at slightly slower speeds than we flew at in the late 1950s. The Boeing 707, which came out in 1958. Flew faster than today's airliners. And we thought we would transcend those speeds with the Concorde in the 1970s. But today, there are no Concordes in the air and no other civil supersonic airplanes. And it's not just airplanes, it's our cars, our planes, even our trains are not radically different than they were 50 years ago. So there's been no meaningful change in transportation technology in the last 50 years. And so one of my research goals is thinking about how to fix this. And my view is you should be able to get anywhere in your city in 5 minutes for $2, and anywhere in the world in 4 hours for $100. So as I've looked at transportation innovations, one of the things that I find consistently is that a big blocker is a law called NEPA, which is called the National Environmental Policy Act, and this is a bill that passed in 1969, took effect January 1st, 1970. And it's a short law, and it seems fairly reasonable and minor if you just read it, but it's actually all pervading and affects almost everything in the physical environment. And the key provision is that for every major federal action significantly affecting the quality of the human environment, an agency must publish a detailed statement of the environmental impacts. But the problem is that federal actions is actually pretty expansive. It's any time the federal government approves a permit, gives a private company authorization to build something, that counts as a federal action. And the word major, major federal action, was actually read out of the law by the implementing regulations. So basically, you have a law that says, before the federal government does anything, it must if it's going to have an environmental impact, it has to do a detailed statement. And by the way, you have to prove that you don't have an environmental impact if you want to avoid that statement, which is actually itself a lot of work. So I see NEPA as a big blocker to transportation technology and infrastructure development. And so that's kind of the margin that I want to see progress on. And fortunately, there are a couple of efforts. Both the Trump administration is doing a notice of proposed rulemaking, has done a notice of proposed rulemaking to modify the NEPA implementing regulations. And Senator Lee also has a bill called the Unshackle Act that would modernize and introduce some limitations on the NEPA process. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll get some reform here and be able to drive transportation technology forward and get a big boost coming out of the COVID pandemic.
All right, so we have sort of two premises. One is governments will be tracking you via cell phones, and two, because of government intervention, we don't have flying cars yet. Excellent. And I think we have a perfect person to offer deeper insights of this, we have Stephen Hicks, who is a senior scholar for the Atlas Society, professor of philosophy, and director of Center for Ethics and Entrepreneurship at Rockford University. Has written numerous books, one of them for the catchy title Nietzsche and the Nazis. And I must warn, I have taken postmodernism as an undergrad. So Stephen, what do you make of this? Is technology a friend or foe, or is that a question we're going to debate forever?
We are going to debate that question forever, and we have been debating that question forever. But yes, I do come at this from a philosophical perspective, and the thing that has struck me, perhaps this is a hammer seeing everything as a nail, but how philosophical we have been in the last 6 months about this, because what the technology and the COVID are asking us to do exactly is confront issues of life and death and freedom and control. And in effect, we all need to be philosophers, and we all have a lot more time to be philosophers as we are thinking about all of these issues. So there's a long pattern, of course, of technology being one of the defining features of human beings surviving in the world. And every time there's a new technology, we have the exact same debates over and over again. We're aware, some of us, of the potential benefits. We're aware of the risks that are involved. We're aware of the costs and so forth. And particularly at the outset, nobody knows the answer to the question, do the benefits outweigh the risks and the costs? And what do we know ahead of time? And in many cases, the debate we have in the short term is shaped by people's philosophical perspectives. That is to say, their cognitive abilities and their character set. So it's a fairly common pattern. Anytime a new technology comes along, some people's automatic reaction is, this is cool. I understand it. I grasp it. I can see the benefits. And I am aware, of course, that there are some risks. But I think people are pretty smart. People are pretty competent. We're going to be able to work out the costs and the benefits as it works along. But I think the benefits are going to outweigh. But that's as an automatic or semi-automatic reaction that people bring to that new technology is the work of philosophical character building ahead of time. And at the same time, there is always a significant group of people who their reaction is negative. They see a threat, they see a risk, they see a cost, and that looms larger in their thinking. In many cases, it drowns out their ability to see the potential benefits. And this pattern is over and over again. And the pattern, of course, is most clear in the modern world because of the pace of innovation and so on. So what I'm especially interested in as a philosopher is if we think, and I think this is going to be the broadly liberal position, that technology is a fruit of human creativity and ingenuity, and that we want to continuously be able to solve problems and develop new things that are going to make life more enjoyable and more meaningful, then we need to have a lot of people in our culture who have the optimistic attitude toward technology. And the question is, how do we do that? And that's a hard issue. One way I like to think about and I'm just going to, in these initial marks, short circuit a few things, is looking not so much at the past, but try to think, we know that we're confronting a life and death situation right now. Okay, so there's some hard science, some hard technology, hard issues in dozens of aspects of our culture that need to be sorted out. At the same time, we know there's going to be another one in the future. There's going to be COVID-26 or COVID-31. I don't know what the number is going to be. So our question is going to be, as we're doing the aftermath of the past 6 months, and as this plays out over the course of the year, how can we better identify what lessons we can learn from this so that we're better ready for the next time? 6 months, an emergency comes along, people go to their priors and automatic habits, right, and so on. So what do we want in terms of people being able to understand that, yes, technology can be used for control, but it also can liberate people? And do we then think that if people are freer, that we think people are pretty smart, people are pretty experimental, that that's going to be the way we're going to solve the problems? How can we instantiate that over the course of the next 5 years, 10 years, and so on. So the way I like to think about it perhaps is, when we went to school, we all did fire drills. And we learned what we're supposed to do when we're a kid if there's a fire that breaks out in the school. Or many workplaces have active shooter drills because that's a new kind of risk. So here we have a virus, and what would our virus drill look like? So we're students, we are parents, we are small-scale entrepreneurs, we're running large institutions, we are the United Way, or we are the Red Cross. How can we prepare ourselves for saying this is going to happen when the next crisis happens? We're not going to be able to sort all of the things out. We're going to have certain things in place that we have drilled, that we have practiced. And if we do that well and in a broad-based way in our culture, we know that people are up to speed on viruses and how to respond on that. We're more likely then to have a more liberal or libertarian response from the policymakers in that case. But to the extent that we don't learn the lessons and the people in charge politically think, oh, people don't understand the issues, they're not going to be able to use the technologies well, we're going to get more authoritarian responses. So I think philosophy, character education, and cognitive education is a big part of our sorting out.
All right, excellent. Before we move into questions, and we do have a lot of questions because, like I said, we have nearly 500 people registered for this. Let me share like a 1 minute of updates of fee. So despite the pandemic, or because of the pandemic, our traffic is basically at record high. And the thing is, those people basically stuck at home consuming our content, which is awesome. Our school seminars or classroom seminars have moved online. So if you want to sort of learn about economics and government or financial literacy, we have a webinar option, and those have been going great. Our learning center, where we develop resources for teachers, that's taking off, and we're definitely gonna be ready to go full steam by the fall. Fee en Español, our content for Spanish language audiences, that's once again exploding. And the project we're really proud of is the Revolution of One, where we teach entrepreneurship and strong moral character to underserved audiences. That is also going strong. If you're interested in any of these products, go to fee.org and check them all out. They're definitely worth looking at. Okay, and now we move to questions, which is my most interesting part. Let's start actually with one question which I want to address to all of you. So it's a very simple question. Will we have more freedom or less freedom after the pandemic? So after the pandemic is over, are we going to emerge in will we have more freedom? Or are we going to have less freedom? To any of you.
I will speak from the education perspective. I teach at university, and I do a lot of philosophy of education, so I keep track on what goes on in K through 12 education. And I'm optimistic that one thing will be a sorting out in the direction of more freedom. The hidebound traditionalist public schools that dominate at least American education are going to have to go through a massive shakeup. And a lot of the traditions that they had been taken for granted and being able to coast along are not going to be there anymore. I think parents and students themselves will be more savvy. They're going to take matters more into their hands. And this will be one more competitive pressure on the education system that leads to more freedom.
All right, Will or Eli?
Right now, I think we're trying to figure out what exactly is going to happen. I mean, at least when, some of the elements that I was talking about earlier, especially the exposure notification API coming out of Google and Apple, it does a lot to ensure that individuals don't tell other people if they have COVID. And so it's privacy protecting and in weird sort of ways. Eli and I have talked a lot about this in other contexts, but if these sorts of things get embedded into a new wave of technology, if this kind of exposure notification app in fact becomes a new sort of technology that's able to be pushed out there, we might actually see something change, for example, in technology that actually preserves privacy and gives people more liberties in that sense. So I think we're kind of still in an early stage. The one thing that I would hesitate, and the one thing that kind of gives me pause in all of this is I don't think that we've really seen the kind of onerous surveillance technology that other that other countries really have engaged in. In particular, South Korea has probably been among the most egregious. You know, they blast out people's COVID. You know, if they're positive for COVID, they basically kind of anonymize the data, but not really anonymize the data, and blast that out to an entire region. And so some people have used this to effectively, you know, dox these individuals, to figure out where their addresses are and to figure out the individuals that actually have COVID. So that's probably the most worrying aspect of all this to me, is that if these technologies that are being pursued by the private sector are not effective, will Congress come back, and will other individuals come back and try to press for something that's even more egregious?
Mm-hmm. Eli?
Well, it seems that the theme of our conversation is a bunch of Lenin quotes. So let me give a quote from Vladimir Lenin. So he says, there's decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen, right? And I think that as Stephen points out, like that's maybe it's happening in higher education, where the crisis is sort of accelerating a structural adjustment that was maybe necessary to happen anyway. And I think that's you know, around the world, that is the case, that there are sort of new equilibria that that reality had sort of resisted, because there was no strong impetus to overcome like the frictions to get there, right? And now a crisis is happening where those frictions are overwhelmed, and you do see pretty big changes. And I think that's a mixed bag for liberty, right? I think you're going to see you know, around the globe, you could see some states, some countries have go in so far into debt that they can never come out of it, and you know, you could start to see some governments really start to fall apart, even through as the crisis exposes sort of pre-existing underlying weaknesses. I think freedom of movement could get restricted pretty severely, unfortunately, you know, around the world, as people realize, one way we can avoid outside infection is just to shut our borders down and to be you know, more isolationist. On the other hand, I think you know, adoption of technology is a force for freedom for the most part. And I think that we're exposing a lot of needed structural reforms in sort of our federal agencies, in FDA and elsewhere. And so I think that basically what the crisis is doing is it's forcing all these structural changes that were always there, were always needed to reach equilibrium, and it's just overwhelming the frictions and making them happen faster. And that's a mixed bag for liberty.
Well, I'm going to counter your Lenin quote, that what Lenin also said is communism is Soviet government plus electrification of the whole country. So there, okay. Obviously, let's switch to more inspiring authors rather than Lenin. And I have a question for Will. Well, what are your thoughts on some IT companies switching some employees to permanent work at home jobs to save costs? Is this happening? You know, is that a good thing?
Yeah. So as you'd mentioned, there are some companies that are allowing their employees to go fully and to work effectively in a remote setting. So this, I think, is going to be a really interesting change over the next couple of years. That, you know, we've already seen this with Twitter has announced it, I believe, last week, 2 weeks ago. Facebook announced it, Google announced it, Shopify announced it. So you will see this change. You know, but as actually we were talking kind of earlier in this conversation before we went live, what happens to the larger labor market? What happens to workers when you're not just competitive in a local area, when you're not just competitive in, say, San Francisco, or you know, you're competitive in New York or Chicago, but that you're competing against people in China and India and in Central and South America. You know, this is both the kind of the long held grail of being a flexible work individual, but also that means that you're potentially competitive with a whole bunch of other individuals that could be located in some other area. So this, to me, is actually going to be a really interesting thing to watch. And I'm not sure that I really have any good answers on the way that it's going to play out. You still see, I think the other part of this, the part of the conversation that we aren't really talking as much about, and something I constantly hammer, which is the we talk a lot about the production agglomerations, as they're said in economics, but consumption agglomerations are hugely important as well. People live in cities and people work near where they work, or live near where they work rather, because they want to be near the kinds of consumptive activities that they like. That DC, for example, I live in DC, the DC region. It has great music. It has great food. There's a whole bunch of things that you can experience. And so as much as we were talking about this pressure to go towards remote work and towards, disaggregating those agglomeration economies when it comes to production, I think we also need to be very cognizant that the reason why people are in cities is because they see these wonderful things to consume in cities.
Okay, Eli has an excellent question for one of our listeners. He says, when it comes to air travel in particular, is it correct to focus on speed as a measure of progress?
I think it's very important. There has been progress, of course, on other dimensions of travel, like fuel efficiency and so on, and that is that's important. But as subsonic air travel has gotten more efficient, that's actually made it more economically difficult to motivate people to invest in a higher speed. And speed is important because of what economists call the gravity equation, right? So economic activity is based on trade across distance is based on that, is a coefficient of that distance. So it's a roughly inverse linear relationship between distance, travel costs, and the amount of trade and economic activity that happens across space. So increasing transportation speed in addition to efficiency is super important for pouring the gasoline on the fire of globalization and accelerating activity. And I think the other thing that we're going to find is that sort of initial generations of supersonic and hypersonic aircraft, are going to be sort of cost competitive with sort of business class and premium class subsonic travel, because you actually don't need as much floor space for a lay flat bed anymore if you can travel faster. So you can actually, there are some efficiencies to be reaped by going faster. The other factor is as you go faster, you fly higher in the atmosphere, and you encounter less drag because there's less air resistance. So there are benefits to be reaped that could in the long run lead to much more efficient travel. All things considered, using both counting both the energy costs and the time costs to opportunity costs of passengers.
Right, and Stephen, you already sort of stepped into the field of education and talking what impact will we have. But one of the listeners is asking, will the educational system improve together with improvements in technology? So obviously, it is right now being sort of disturbed or shaken. Will actually the whole education system, will it emerge as a better choice, as a better option? Will it improve as improvements of technology continue to happen?
Yeah, I don't think we will have a monolithic education system the way we have had it. Instead, I think what we will have is a series of education systems. And my expectation is that it will be a lot better because it will be much more customized to each individual. Parents and can work with their kids, and they know their kids better. Kids can pursue their own interests and check in with teachers and their parents and other mentors and so forth much more easily. So yeah, it'll be better.
Okay. A question for all or for any of you. A listener wants to know, could you please comment on the USA Freedom Reauthorization Act? Any takers?
I'm not up to speed on it, so I won't.
Will and Eli?
So yeah, FISA reauthorization. Yeah, that was very sad that we did not have a larger conversation about what was effectively a large collection effort. So, part of this conversation, I guess the other thing that I would, to be completely honest, I in past years I focused a lot on this issue, but I haven't done so much recently on it, primarily because our organization is and especially the kind of work that I'm interested in, is really about getting individuals, back to work and all that kind of good stuff. And in doing that, though, I guess that's part of the problem that we're also seeing with Congress, is that some issues that really do need to be talked about, some issues that really do need to be discussed far more extensively, they aren't being discussed. And so you have these issues, you have these laws that are effectively being reauthorized, and there really isn't a broad discussion about it. But then again, when you think about the tensions that exist for some time, most people, even when you bring this stuff up, even though there was obviously a big hubbubaloo when Edward Snowden obviously released a lot of documents related to these collection efforts, the simple fact is that people haven't been as interested and as engaged in this issue whenever it does come up. So this has been the constant battle that, having worked on this in the past, that I feel like I wish more people cared about it, but it seems that we care about it. There's some other people that care about, but it's just not really a big issue in the broader American political context, which is, to me, very, very worrying. But that also means that in instances like this, it easily gets passed and there's basically no conversation about it.
Well, for me, it suggests that perhaps we should have a town hall about this particular issue. It would be I think our listeners would be definitely interested in finding out more. I have not so much of a question as a proposal, which says that with remote work, we need to institute and send Congress home. There is no need for them to be in Washington, D.C. any longer. I think that's a valid proposition. I would add to that perhaps European Parliament should stop traveling from Brussels to Strasbourg once a year. For those of you sort of not familiar with European politics, the seat of European Parliament, European Commission, and all the bureaucrats is Brussels. But for 2 months per year, they pack everything, and I literally mean everything. All the bureaucrats, all members of Parliament, everything, and they go to Strasbourg for 2 months. Now, obviously, Strasbourg loves that. Rent prices are high, rent revenues are high, but European Parliament, the one that talks about efficiency, the one that talks about greenery and all this stuff, basically just have this traveling circus thing. So yes, stop that, and yes, send Congress home. Even though I wonder where are they doing less harm, in DC or at home? Anyway, moving to a more technological question. This one is for Stephen, and there's an amalgamation of a couple of questions. So from what you're saying, it pretty much seems that technology is always, more benefits and less cost. I mean, technology seems like always to be like a net benefit. Why does the opposition to technology persist? Why are there still Luddites or people who want to smash the cotton gin of these days?
Well, I think there are two reasons there. One is cognitive, and one has to do with character. The cognitive one is technology is new, and it takes an act of thinking and a lot of effort to figure out what this new thing is all about. You have to learn, you have to try to predict the changes, and that's hard work. And there's always a large number of people who either don't have the cognitive skills to be able to do that, or they don't have the cognitive effortfulness to be able to do that. But they are put in a situation where they have to do that. They feel overwhelmed and they feel resentful that they have to do that. Another thing is that technology always forces change, right? Whatever it is that you are doing, if you are doing it automatically by rote, the new technology comes along and it says you have to change, you have to adapt, you have to do something different. And in some cases, there's a laziness component in a large number of people, or an inertia component in a large number of people. They just don't want to do it. I've been doing this for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. I resent the idea that I have to change because I'm happy in my rut. But the other thing I think has to do with fear, and this is where another character issue, courage, is of course a bedrock in life. We need it in all aspects of life. But anytime we are doing something new that's untested, that has risks, it requires us to confront the possibility that we are going to fail a lot and it might not work out. And we do know that some people do not have strong courage. They don't like the prospect of failure. They're not comfortable with it. So the cognitive demands that technology and innovation puts on people, the effort demands that it puts on people, the being willing to fail a lot before you eventually succeed, puts a lot of stress on people. And those are seemingly historically constants in a significant portion of the population.
Okay, well, give me an historical insight. Do you think these things sort of happened when someone invented the wheel or the bow, or was these things, or were these inventions so obviously good that no one disputed them?
No, that's a very interesting question, and that raises a cognitive issue. Some inventions, the benefits of them are more easily graspable. You can see it at a perceptual level. So the wheel is a very good example, right? Or someone invents fire, you can feel the heat and so on. But what has happened in the modern world with science and technology is it's becoming increasingly abstract. So what is the benefit of a steam engine? Well, that's hard to grasp for a lot of people. What's the benefit of a computer chip? If you don't have that technical knowledge and the scientific knowledge, then you're not going to be able to grasp them. And it seems like you're just asking to take it on faith. So in the case, for example, of COVID-19 is a perfect example of this, because this is a health risk, but it involves a virus, and it's something that people can't see. And so it's not like I'm being attacked by a crocodile. That might be scary, but I can at least see the crocodile and I know what I'm dealing with. Being attacked by an invisible thing, it's hard to wrap my mind around. So it's that, plus it's a life and death issue, which everybody's naturally fearful of. So I can't understand it, and it's very scary. Then we are setting up for a certain kind of a negative reaction.
All right. I had a question for Will. So Will, you talked a lot about broadband and the importance of good internet connection during the pandemic. Do you see the risk that some politicians might come in and start saying, from now on, internet is a necessity, kind of like water or gas or electricity, therefore we should be free internet for everyone or free government internet for everyone? Do you see this kind of risk of government stepping in to fix the problem that doesn't really exist?
Yeah, no, I mean, this has already happened. I mean, there's already been push for, and I forget the name of the actual act, but this is already happening right now. And this is something that I've, was just actually having a conversation with some folks about this yesterday. So you're already seeing it occur. I mean, there's a lot to be said about this, but the thing that I like to point out that's probably most important is that when you actually ask, why aren't people online and why aren't they connected? 20% of it is because of cost, very clearly, but 60% of the reason why people aren't online, according to census data, is because they don't see it as relevant or useful in their lives. That, I think, might change. It might shift with this current pandemic, but this larger question of will then broadband become should it become an essential facility is, again, it seems to be becoming part of the larger conversation. But when you ask people, well, okay, do you want to pay for it? They almost universally don't want to pay for it. They don't want to see government pay for it. And so it really is this tension between wanting to have this and obviously clearly seeing that broadband is important for communities and important for economic development. But at the same time, it really just, people, one, aren't willing to pay for it. And two, those that aren't connected really aren't connected for reasons that are not related to cost or to deployment.
Okay, Eli, I very much like your slogan of $2 and 5 minutes anywhere in the city. Now that sounds like a government program to me. Prove me in 1 minute how free market can achieve this.
Well, I think it's going to happen through vehicle sharing and through autonomy. So that's really the only way you're going to be able to make it happen. But it's, imagine, being, Uber, but instead of being driven by a human being in their car, you have a hyper efficient electric vehicle driven by itself without a human in the loop. And the vehicles are all able to talk to each other and move about the city quickly. Maybe not for $2 initially, but at a slightly higher price point. I think we're not that far away. Certainly within the next 10 years, it's very possible that we'll have autonomous flying electric vehicles. So you could get picked up at a vertiport, as they call it, near where you live, or maybe even have a car pick you up and take you to the vertiport to go all the way across town in a matter of minutes. And so the things that are driving this are autonomy, which is technologically easy in aircraft, regulatorily hard. and autonomy in cars, which is technologically very, very challenging. But regulatorily, there seems to be a path that people want to follow. And then the other technology is electrification, which drastically cuts down on maintenance of vehicles and a lot of the sort of fleet costs. And as the cost of batteries gets driven down, and as we learn more about automation, I'm hopeful that we'll find ways to move people across town very, very quickly. And that plays into a lot of what Will was talking about with sort of changes in the labor market and in remote work. It may be possible to expand labor pools significantly, even if we don't shift completely to remote work.
Okay, I'm definitely taking that $2 5 minutes slogan and selling to some candidates. And we have a final question for Stephen. Could you sort of give us a sort of a wider, deeper view? Won't this crisis lead to more government controls? After all, we do have a precedent for a governor to basically unilaterally dictate activities and lockdowns throughout entire states. So what do you think? Does the COVID set a precedent for more lockdowns, or does it actually set a precedent for rebellion against lockdowns? What do you think is going to happen?
That's unpredictable, and it really depends on the choices that we're going to make. I think it's clear over the last 3 decades we've had a drift towards centralization and deferential, a populace being more deferential to authority figures. The amount of power that's been concentrated in the office of the presidency now compared to the 1980s, I mean, it's a vertical chart. Particularly on matters of health, through the early 2000s, and particularly in the Obama presidency, we had a huge cultural shift to seeing the whole area of health as something that really is the government's purview. And so we're, again, deferential to the government much more on health matters. The idea that I should take responsibility for my health, people still have that, of course, but it's much lesser than it was culturally. But at the same time, health is one of those issues that is particularly difficult because we want the best. We know all sorts of things scientifically. There's all kinds of technology, and the vast majority of people do not have the science and technology education to make the proper assessments in those areas. Now, in a free society, we say, well, that's why you go to experts and you get yourself up to speed on the internet, and you talk to your physicians and you read the AMA site and so forth. But all of those cognitive habits and self-responsibility habits, they need to be worked on. And I think we have lost that over the course of the last 20 years or so to a significant extent. Plus, there is the fear factor. And if we want to have a free society, we are saying very robustly, you need to be confident that you can take on all of life challenges, right, without big government, without big daddy, right, and so forth. And that means a lot of character education, a lot of cognitive education. Now, I think in this particular crisis, Americans and Canadians even more so, where I'm from originally, were partly for benevolent reasons being willing to give the governments the benefit of the doubt at the state level, the local level, the federal level as well, partly because of the increase of centralization, partly because of kind of a somewhat naive view that governments always know best and governments have their best interests. But I do think at the same time, we're starting to see what I think of as a kind of a standard American sense of life thing starting to reassert itself, particularly as the numbers come in and as the costs of the lockdowns and some of the overreach that has occurred. But I think people will say, look, this is a problem. We went through it. We gave it a try. We have learned our lesson. And we've also learned about the dangers of government overreach that we could, of course, have a cultural renewal in the direction of saying the next time this happens, let us sort it out for ourselves. We know the drill. We know what to do. But that's a choice.
Indeed it is. And your choice is to switch to us on June the 1st, when we're going to be talking about environmentalism at 1 p.m. So if you care about environment, or if you care about people who care about environment, even if you don't care about environment, actually at 1 p.m. we're going to have an excellent talk about what free market environmentalism could be, etc. Second plug is, If you ever wondered, was Jesus a socialist? Now we have a book that actually answers that. A book by Larry Reed, the President Emeritus of FEE. It's available at Amazon. I think it's available on our website as well. $14.95, and you get the entire book with, well, basically a question answered, was Jesus a socialist? So you can talk to your friends on Sundays. Let me thank Will and Eli, both from Center for Growth and Opportunity. If our listeners are interested in learning more about regulation of technology, how government is tracking you via your cell phone, and what's going to happen to our air travel, go and check out these guys at Center for Growth and Opportunity, and of course Stephen Hicks at Atlas Society. If you wonder about the more philosophical aspects of freedom and technology and the future, he's definitely your go-to guy. Thank you for being with us, and I shall see you on June the 1st.